David Zaslav, James Gunn, and Ezra Miller should be thanking their lucky stars that there is a world where Kathleen Kennedy is somehow in charge of making movies, because they are living in infamy right now. I talked about just how bad The Flash is doing. It's going to be flirting with potentially losing more money than John Carter and The Lone Ranger, the two biggest money losers in cinematic history. But it's not going to be in the news all that much longer, because there's another movie, another stinker that's waiting to lose a tremendous amount of money. And the way the numbers are tracking now and the way that it looks, because of the massive budget of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, it might actually make The Flash seem like not such a big debacle, because they are about to lose so much money. The tracking has been going in the wrong direction. We've had the long-term forecast for quite some time, and every time they update it, the numbers just shrink and shrink and shrink, and it's not looking better, because people are starting to hear word of mouth about what this movie is about and wondering, I like Harrison Ford. I like Indiana Jones. Do I want to support this god-awful movie? I've already experienced one bad Indiana Jones movie, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Do I want to go back for another when it appears that the writing is on the wall, that it's not going to be very good? Even the uppity, bougie crowd at Cannes Film Festival couldn't get behind Phoebe Waller-Bridge, basically replacing Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones. We'll get to that. Now let's talk about this trending and why this looks all so bad, and why there's a good chance, if things do not turn around soon, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny could be the biggest financial loss in Hollywood history. At the beginning of June, box office tracking website Box Office Pro predicted the film would have a domestic opening weekend between 81 and $111 million. They predicted the film's entire domestic theatrical run would gross between $225 and $380 million. However, the most recent estimates had James Mangold's stint at the helm heading for a 3-day domestic debut in the $65 million range, which isn't ideal when you consider that not only is this the fifth and final installment in one of the most iconic franchises there's ever been, it's also miles behind the $100 million debut for Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, scored a decade and a half ago. So they're tracking at about 65% of the opening weekend of a movie that came out 15 years ago. That is absolutely terrible. We're talking orders of magnitude less interest in this movie. And that $65 million projection is the high-end total. And that is pretty damn close to The Flash. What is different about The Flash and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny? Well, besides one of them being a superhero movie and the other one being more like an adventure kind of movie, one of them cost a cool $300 million to make, while the other cost a cool $200 million to make. Unfortunately for Kathleen Kennedy, Lucasfilm, and Disney, somehow Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny cost more money to make than a goddamn Flash movie where he's traveling through time the entire time and interacting with about 50 different versions of himself and different versions of all the other heroes, with cameos from like every Batman in the history of DC Studios. Like, just imagine how much money it costs to bring all those cameos in. How did Kathleen Kennedy waste an extra $100 million on Indiana Jones? We know there were lots of reshoots, so in all likelihood, Indiana Jones cost more than $300 million that people actually know about. They likely need to make like $900 million worldwide, or pretty damn close to it, just to break even. Now, they are tracking a little bit ahead domestically of The Flash. You know, The Flash only made $55 million, and Indiana Jones is tracking $10 million ahead. Perhaps there's a chance. Well, once you start looking into the numbers on a global scale, it starts looking a whole lot worse for Indiana Jones, Kathleen Kennedy, and poor Harrison Ford. How did he get suckered into it? Dial of Destiny is on course to tank spectacularly in China, with its worldwide opening now thought to be heading somewhere in the $140 million range. Just to put things into perspective, The Flash, which is already being deemed as one of the biggest money losers in Hollywood history, hauled in $139 million in ticket sales just a couple of weeks ago during its first frame. It's also worth noting that the rumored $295 million budget makes Dial of Destiny exponentially more expensive. So while it's trending a little bit better domestically, it's trending basically the same on a worldwide scale for Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. That is very bad news. And some of you may be asking, but Harrison Ford is a big superstar. Everyone knows who Harrison Ford is. Why aren't they wanting to go see Indiana Jones in China? Now, if you were Disney, and actually they already did this, they actually called everyone in China racist for not supporting their terrible Little Mermaid live action, whatever you want to call it. They've never actually released an Indiana Jones movie in China. So this is an IP and a character that they're completely unfamiliar with and has no box office draw in China to begin with. Now, when you make a movie and you schedule out the budget, perhaps, just maybe, you take into consideration the worldwide potential of the characters and the story that you're doing. Well, this character's never actually been known in China. Maybe we shouldn't make this one of the biggest budgeted movies in Hollywood history with the hope that maybe China will support something they've never actually seen. And to make things worse, China does have its own box office with its own movies coming out, and there just so happens to be a big Chinese movie opening the same weekend as Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. This movie is absolutely screwed because it's not going to get supported anywhere outside the United States for the most part. Maybe a little bit in Europe and stuff like that, but Europe just doesn't go to enough movies to save a box office, where we know that Asia does. Asia has saved the Fast and the Furious franchise on many occasions from having pretty ho-hum or average domestic numbers, but blowing up worldwide. Asia pretty much saved Aquaman, the only movie in the DCEU, I think, that ever went over $1 billion. It actually did kind of okay domestically, but absolutely blew up in Asia, specifically in China. And they are not supporting this movie. Y'all are absolutely screwed. And they're just going to lose so much money. And once you start looking at some of the other trending indicators, besides just some of these box office projections, it definitely backs up what we're seeing here from a lot of these things. Looking under the hood of the Dial of Destiny's domestic outlook, we hear pre-sales for Dial of Destiny stood at under $6 million last Friday, ahead of No Time to Die. That total is not too far from John Wick Chapter 4 and Fast 10, which had respective stateside debuts of $73.8 million and $67 million total. Those numbers aren't very good, and they're basically right in line with the high-end projections of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny right now. The big difference, obviously, of John Wick Chapter 4 and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is John Wick Chapter 4 cost $100 million, not $300 million. So it actually makes sense, and they're able to turn a slight profit, if not even a little bit more than that, with $500 million in worldwide sales for that John Wick movie. And when you look at Fast 10, as I mentioned earlier, gets enormous support from China and basically all of Asia. So Fast 10 can actually debut in the US and just do kind of okay numbers, but it can rely on the overseas box office, specifically in Asia, to kind of make up for some of the failings that it has in the US, because it's just more popular outside of the US. The only thing at this point that can save Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is good word of mouth. That's basically what saved Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 from losing money. Not a lot of people trust the MCU these days. The opening weekend totals domestically weren't all that good. They're certainly better than Indiana Jones and The Flash and some of these other movies, but it wasn't exactly in line with what had happened with the MCU prior, especially on a lot of these sequel movies with properties that people were familiar with. It went under what they thought it was going to do, but the movie was so well received by the audience and the word of mouth was so good that it ended up actually turning a profit and doing pretty damn well, because people didn't just stop seeing the movie once they heard what their neighbors had to say about it. Once their neighbors came home and said, I saw Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, it was really good, you should check it out, they went and did that. Will that happen with Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny? From what I've heard so far, I don't believe so. In fact, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, there are some early reviews out there, and they're certainly not trending in the right direction. And if you go and read into those further, the things that stand out for them in a positive way, I don't believe are going to resonate with Joe Normie going to the movies on the weekend with his best gal trying to have a good time. A common theme among early reviews is that the film is better than Indy's last outing, the rather polarizing Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull from 2008, but not much better. Many reviewers took issue with digitally de-aging Ford for some of the scenes and the use of CGI overall, but there was plenty of praise for Phoebe Waller-Bridge and, of course, Ford, who still oozes charm as the adventuring archaeologist. What is one of the big common complaints about The Flash that really turned people off? Over-reliance on CGI. What's one of the big common complaints about the MCU at large, specifically like Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania? Overuse of CGI looks like an absolute mess. You are going to get some of that right here in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It feels like a movie that should have more practical effects than CGI. I understand that if you want Harrison Ford to play a younger version of himself, you have to de-age him, you have to use that technology or whatever, but they should probably use practical effects in basically every movie when they can. And then the big standout with the Cannes Film Festival bougie, uppity, snooty reviewers is that Phoebe Waller-Bridge was really good. Well, I've heard from some people that have actually seen the movie that actually have the pulse of what people want to see, and they don't like Phoebe Waller-Bridge. They reminded her of Rey. No one liked Rey. She was a Mary Sue, and it sounds like Phoebe Waller-Bridge is also a Mary Sue. It doesn't help that every time she goes out there and speaks, she comes off as grating. Let's put it that way. She comes off as somebody that I don't want to support. Is she Ezra Miller? Is she an Ezra Miller level impediment to the success of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny? Absolutely not. She's not a criminal. She's certainly not somebody as creepy as Ezra Miller, but she just might be the next Brie Larson, who's basically not been a value add to the MCU itself. So we shall see what happens. The good news for David Zaslav, James Gunn, Ezra Miller is you might not be in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons for too much longer. It looks like because of its absolutely bloated budget of $300 million, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is likely to go down as the biggest money loser of all times, unless there's good word of mouth and people actually start supporting the movie after the opening weekend, which I highly doubt. I don't think that's going to happen. It certainly hasn't helped that Kathleen Kennedy has gone out there and actually talked to people about her thoughts about Phoebe Waller-Bridge and the future of the franchise. We shall see. I had a good conversation with my good friend Aaron Sparrow talking about how Kathleen Kennedy was absolutely willing this movie to failure, and it looks like it's about to happen bigger than any of us could have ever expected. Definitely check this video out right here. There's also a link in the video description.